All of you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Sierra. Super appreciate you hosting this for us. Super thankful to Kathy approaching us and hosting this webinar for all of your members. We are so grateful to be able to be here and spread the good work into all the good work that all of you are doing in order to support survivors who have survived something, and we really appreciate the work that you are doing. Specific to today, we are going to be talking about supporting survivors who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. And don't worry, we're going to give you a general overview of who that may be or what that may look like. But I am so grateful that, Sarah had many of you share who's with us today, because that really helps kind of drive the conversation that we're going to be doing. So my name is Erica Dennison, and I work for the Arc of Aurora, and I'm also joined by my colleague, Krystal Dawson. And we are going to also be providing you with some materials that will be sent to you in a follow-up email after today. So that includes many things such as like a developmental checklist, a communication support tool for people with developmental disabilities. You have the option to request that poster or those communication quick tips that CCASA can send to you, as well as information about local disability-related resources here within our community to make sure that you are getting connected with the right people in the event that you are supporting a survivor who has a developmental disability. So today, we could probably talk about everything today in a full day training, so this certainly will be more of a primer. But today we're going to give you a general overview of who people with developmental disabilities are, victimization of people with disabilities. We definitely want to talk about disability bias and accommodations, as well as an overview of Colorado's developmental disability system and resources. So I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Krystal, to dive on in.
Awesome. Thank you, Erica. So before we get into the specifics, I'd love to just dive in and give you an overview of who the ARC is and who exactly it is that we help. Next slide, please. So often what we'll hear from folks if you are in Colorado is that you may have seen the ARC thrift stores around. And we really appreciate that if you have, because while we're not the thrift stores themselves, that might be how you've heard of us, because when you shop or donate there, some of that money comes back to help the ARC chapters in Colorado. And the Arc of Aurora, which is where we're from, for those not in Colorado, we're out in like the east side of Denver. We are one of 15 Colorado chapters that serves people of all ages with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. Specifically, we provide individual advocacy to our clients, connect folks to the resources that they need, and provide referrals. And then our chapter specifically also has a training and education program called THINK+change. We are a small but mighty and also growing team of 9. 6 of our team are individual advocates, and then there's Erica and I and our executive director. We are an affiliate of the Arc of the United States, and there are many chapters affiliated across the states. You may come across a chapter in another state outside of Colorado and notice that they actually provide direct support services like residential group homes, supported employment, and all that direct service work. In Colorado, however, we are advocacy only chapters. Next slide, please. So when we say intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities, or IDD, what exactly do we mean by that? And what is the difference between those two terms? So you can think of developmental disabilities as an umbrella term that can include intellectual disabilities, but it's really a broad term for a group of conditions that are due to an impairment in physical learning, language, or behavioral areas, and they appear in the developmental period of someone's life. They can impact day-to-day functioning and usually last throughout a person's lifetime. And then underneath that umbrella, we have intellectual disabilities as a subcategory of developmental disabilities. And these can appear anytime before a child turns 18 and are characterized by problems with intellectual functioning or intelligence, which includes the ability to learn, reason, problem solve, and other skills. There also can be some problems with adaptive behavior, which can include everyday social and life skills. Oftentimes, intellectual disabilities are diagnosed using an IQ test. And again, because intellectual disabilities are a subcategory of developmental disabilities, there are people who have developmental disabilities that don't include an intellectual disability, and it doesn't affect their intellectual functioning at all. And then, when we say intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD, that's used to describe a situation in which an intellectual disability and other developmental disabilities are present. And IDDs are caused by an array of factors. They can be genetic, or sometimes they can come from environmental exposures and illnesses, and they are diagnosed using a variety of tests. Next slide, please. So while there are many types of developmental disabilities, I want to just touch briefly on some better known ones so that you have a better understanding of who exactly it is that we serve at the ARC. So like we had mentioned, people with intellectual disabilities, that is a form of a developmental disability. Autism spectrum disorder is an example of a commonly known developmental disability. Autism is a sensory processing and communication disorder causing problems in social interaction and communication. And autism spectrum disorder is exactly that. It's a spectrum. So it can include limited or repetitive patterns of behavior. And for some people with autism, it'll affect their speech. You might meet someone who is nonverbal or had delayed speech growing up, or it might not affect their speech at all. And really, a person with autism can have all ranges of abilities because it is a spectrum. So you might meet someone who needs a lot of support and it has lower functioning, or you might meet someone who is very independent and they might not need much support, or you might not be able to tell that they have autism. Another example is cerebral palsy, or CP, which is an example of one of those developmental disabilities that doesn't always include an intellectual disability. In fact, a lot of the people that we know in our local community have higher IQs than we do who have CP. And then there is Down syndrome, which is a very common developmental disability, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD, which is an example of a developmental disability which is not genetic. That describes a group of conditions that can occur in a person whose mother drank alcohol during pregnancy. And those effects can include physical, behavior, and learning problems. And oftentimes a person with FASD has a mix of those challenges. So that's just a brief list of examples. There are many, many other developmental disabilities, but I wanted to just touch on some of the more common ones. I also want to note that developmental disabilities are different from mental illness. A mental illness is something that can be mitigated or treated, and developmental disabilities are lifelong. However, someone with a developmental disability can have a co-occurring disability, such as a mental illness, a physical disability, or a learning disability, such as like ADHD. Disability is never like an either or situation. We're all unique, and so those diagnoses can vary from person to person and be co-occurring. Next slide, please. So that is exactly who we support at the Arc of Aurora and at the other ARC chapters, is people with IDD and their families. We do this through providing info and referrals. We also do systems and class change advocacy. We have a community education and training program called THINK+change, and we do direct individual advocacy. Next slide, please. So what exactly does that individual advocacy look like? So the disability world, as I'm sure many of you coming from the victim services world know, can be very complicated and full of different systems of supports and services, such as the special education system or the very confusing world of government benefits. So our individual advocates are trained to understand the rules, regulations, and laws that govern those different systems. And then they work with children, adults, and families and focus on trying to get the best outcomes and making the changes that people need. They really are there to make sure that their clients have a voice and get to be included in the decisions that affect their lives when otherwise they might be ignored in those decision-making processes. They provide support and knowledge, but advocates don't deliver direct services and don't have any decision-making power on behalf of the individuals and families. They are advocates rather than case managers. And while our advocates are not victim advocates, we do often work with folks with IDD in Aurora who have been victims. And we work closely with victim service organizations such as CCASA to make sure that our clients are getting equal access to supports and services. And we also try to provide expertise about serving the IDD community and navigating those disability systems to those agencies. Next slide, please. So if you ever run across somebody in the community who you think could benefit from our expertise, go ahead and give us a call or head to our website. We serve folks in Aurora, Colorado, but there are chapters all over. If you're ever in doubt at whether we are the right ones to help, give us a call or fill out our intake form on our website. And through that intake process, we'll figure out if we're the right fit. And if we are not, we will get you over to the person who is the right fit. All righty, so that's just a brief introduction to who we are and who we serve. So I'd love to turn it over to Erica again to talk about the ADA.
Thank you so much, Krystal. Appreciate it. So today we wanted to have an opportunity to talk with all of you about the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, because in some way, shape, or form, all of us are kind of responsible for making sure it happens within our own workplace for the people that we are supporting. And that includes you when you're supporting survivors of a crime. What's really great is the ADA is actually approaching and celebrating its 33rd anniversary this month. So what I want you to know is that the ADA is ultimately a law that protects the rights of individuals with disabilities. And it basically ensures to make sure that they have the same opportunities as everyone else to access all areas of public life. So it makes it also illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities. It was actually initially signed by President George H.W. Bush in 1990, and then some updates were made by the other Bush in 2008. So overall, what I want you to know is that the ADA, it is a big, confusing law. But what I want you to know is it really does aim to promote equality and equity and inclusion and accessibility for making sure that people with disabilities have the ability to participate fully in all areas of public life, just like everyone else. There was also something called the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And there's this big, huge, long act, and all the way at the bottom was Section 504. And Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was actually the first disability civil rights law to be enacted in the United States. And that was kind of the first call to make sure that it helped prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in places that receive specifically federal funds. So that includes things like currently like public education, Medicaid, things like that. What actually happened with the Rehabilitation Act is in 1972, it was kind of put on the desk of President Nixon, and then he vetoed it. He didn't sign it because he thought it was going to be too costly. And then a bunch of disability advocates within our community came forth and was like, this isn't right. You know, people need to have access to general things, you know, think about sidewalks, right? And we have these curb cuts that go basically from the sidewalk to the street. And how easy is that to just go from the sidewalk to the street? Well, many, many moons ago, many decades ago, that didn't exist. And Krystal kind of likes to use the statement of people kind of had to like parkour their mobility device off the side of the curb because there was no safe way to get it down. So that's an example that I want you to kind of think about as we're kind of going through this discussion. The ADA actually does apply to all areas of public life. That includes the work that you do, or in the space that you work at. It's applicable to law enforcement agencies, nonprofits, the gamut. But it actually does not apply to religious organizations like places of worship, because this exemption is based on the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which basically protects freedom of religion. And so you may find that places of worship may not necessarily be fully accessible or necessarily follow all aspects of the ADA because they're basically exempt. What I also want you to know is that schools that receive federal funds must also comply with Section 504 of the Rehab Act, as well as the ADA. And the ADA is made up in 5 titles, and these are very simplified explanations and a very general overview, because I really want you to understand that the ADA is a very complex law with really specific requirements and legal interpretations. And so for detailed information, I really encourage you to visit the official ADA website or really seek professional legal assistance if it's specific to your organization. But when it comes to kind of a simplified overview, it's broken out into 5 titles. So Title 1 is employment. That basically prohibits employment discrimination against people with disabilities within the workplace. And I think that's usually what people generally think about when they think of Title 1, is it's specific to like workplace. And actually, it also requires employers with 15 or more employees to provide equal job opportunities, reasonable accommodations, and prohibits discrimination in all aspects of employment. That includes things like hiring, promotions, termination, things like that. There's also Title II, based upon the poll. I'm trying to remember who was with us. There's a lot of law enforcement agencies, for example. Title II applies to many of you who are on this call. That covers like public services and programs provided by state and local government. That includes things like school, transportation services. And what I want you to know is also that state agencies, state and local government agencies that actually have 50 or more employees are required under Title II to designate like an ADA coordinator within the workplace. So some of you may be watching this and maybe you are the ADA coordinator, or maybe you aren't too sure who that may be. And I would encourage you to explore that and find out who the ADA coordinator is within your agency, because they can really help you with addressing disability related inquiries specific to the work that you do, any grievances, coordinating efforts to make sure that people with disabilities are getting equitable access to your services and programming. There's also Title III. That's generally what we like to call public accommodations. That includes things that covers like nonprofits, businesses, movie theaters, restaurant. You think of all the places that we go in our community, that's generally covered under Title III. And that basically means that places need to be designed and constructed in compliance with the ADA. So for example, you can't build a building with 15 steps that people walk up without some type of handicapped accessible entrance, right? Or if you have an 8-floor building, and it's a brand new construction, we want to make sure that there's an elevator there, right? So that people can get up and down to where they need to go. So what I want you to know is that these types of places are not specifically mandated to have an ADA coordinator, but it really is still advisable for these places to, within their businesses or organizations, to have someone that can handle ADA related inquiries, because it just can make everyone's life easier. And so there's also Title IV, that's telecommunications and relay services. And so there's something called 711. And gosh, I will tell you, first and foremost, we all have a smartphone, and technology has definitely advanced the accessibility for people with disabilities, because they can text, or they can use different types of apps to help with communicating with folks. But Title IV of the ADA with telecommunications, that's still something that's around, and I don't see it going anywhere in the foreseeable future. But there's something in which you can call 711. That's wherever you are in the United States. And it basically means that, say I am a person who I am deaf or hard of hearing, and I want to call Krystal, right? My colleague here on this training. I would dial 711, and what I would do is I would actually type a message to an operator on the other line who picks up the phone and is verbally, it can verbally contact someone else for you, or can type. And what I would type to the operator is, I want to call my colleague Krystal. And so they would receive that communication through typing. They get the call, they'd actually call Krystal and speak to Krystal. And then they can kind of have this relay service conversation with kind of the middleman of the 711 operator there to help with any type of communication. There's also miscellaneous provisions. That's Title V. I always kind of say that that's kind of the catch-all, that for all the other things within the ADA that doesn't apply to Titles 1 through 4. But what I really want you to know is that this is just a very simplified explanation and a very general overview. And again, for really detailed information, I would really encourage you to seek that as professional legal advice or check out the ADA website. To be protected by the ADA, one must have a disability or have a relationship or association with the individual with the disability. If you're looking for a nice, long, clean list that says, what are all the impairments covered by the ADA, you're not going to find it, because the ADA does not specifically name all the impairments that are covered. But what I want you to know is that the ADA defines a person with a disability as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And gentle reminder for all of you, I think you may just think of like disability as something that you see, like maybe it's a wheelchair user, someone using a cane, getting out of a handicapped parking spot at a Walmart, for example. I want to remind you that not all disabilities are visible, and that's something that's really important to note, especially when we're working with survivors who have developmental disabilities. You may be asked to provide a reasonable accommodation to someone who has a disability. And so what I want to say is, when I say accommodation, it's super easy. It's super simple. It's basically the process of adapting or adjusting your services and programming to make sure that that person with a disability has equitable access just like anyone else would. So perfect example, our friends at CICASA who are hosting this webinar, they provided a reasonable accommodation by providing a sign language interpreter here on this call for someone who requested an accommodation. That is a perfect example of a reasonable accommodation. So great job, CICASA, right? They did it. Super easy, right? Another really easy accommodation could be maybe providing materials in larger font. Maybe it's someone who's blind or visually impaired and they can't see the teeny weeny text on a certain material that you provided them. Giving them in larger font, that's an easy, reasonable accommodation. Reading materials out loud if it's someone who maybe is unable to read. Service animals, that's another reasonable accommodation. Allowing individuals with disabilities to be accompanied by their trained service animals in public places is a reasonable accommodation. Those service animals are specifically trained to assist people with disabilities with specific tasks. Allowing extra time could be a really great accommodation. Maybe that's completing paperwork. Maybe that's completing other items that are needed for your work that when you're supporting someone with a developmental disability. And there's so much more. I just wanted to kind of get your wheels turning on what that could look like. So that is certainly not an exhaustive list by any means. But what I want you to know, though, simply is that you just must make every effort to accommodate if someone does request a reasonable accommodation. And I bring this up because there are lawsuits and fines that can happen. If a person with a disability feels that they've been discriminated against, they can file a complaint with the Department of Justice. But what I want you to know is that they don't file a complaint to get like monetary damages or income from this. I think sometimes people think, oh, people complain about certain things so that they can get money back in court. And that's not really what happens. Really, what happens is these complaints are submitted, they're investigated with really the goal of making sure that it doesn't happen to another person again. So there really are limitations and the types of damages that can be obtained by the person who may be filed. So if someone asks for an accommodation, you must accommodate, right? If you have questions, seek counsel from your ADA coordinator, regional technical assistance area, or even attorney. So I know that we have folks on this call who are beyond Colorado, but specific to Colorado, there is the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. They are a technical center that can provide ADA assistance and answer any questions that you have. And the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, I can't recall all the states that they support, but it's kind of along the Rocky Mountain front range, if you will, so they can support multiple states. So quick Google search certainly can get you the information that you need. So I'm going to hand it off to Krystal to talk a little bit about disability bias.
Thank you. Yeah, so now that we have covered the ADA and how it helps us support people with disabilities, I want to talk about bias because the ADA, is to address those barriers that can come up and prevent people from getting the best services that they can get out of public life. But also bias can be a very big barrier when it comes to people with disabilities. Next slide, please. So I'm sure you've all, especially in all of the different lines of work that we saw, have taken some form of bias training before. So I'm going to try to actually make this section a little interactive to hear from you all. And we really want to talk about bias specific to people with disability. In a 2014 study on bias, they found that more than 1 in 3 people show a bias against those with a disability, which is higher than rates of bias based on gender or race. It's important to know that biases are common. It's a side effect of just living in a society with other people. And a lot of people try to, deny that they have bias because it's like such an icky feeling. It makes you feel like you're a bad person, but it's gonna happen in all of us. And it's important to try to identify what those biases are and challenge them so that we can show up being our best selves, giving our best supports to people with disabilities. So diving in a little further, bias breaks into 2 categories, so implicit and explicit bias. And before we get into what each of those mean, if you guys have any ideas of what an implicit bias is or an explicit bias is and what those could mean for people with disabilities, so try to think about an implicit bias that someone could have against someone with a disability or an explicit bias. If you can think of any of those, pop those in the chat and I'll read those a little later on into the section. Next slide, please. So implicit bias is an attitude or a stereotype that affects our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So this is the type of bias that is involuntary. We're unaware of them and don't intend to have them. A very basic, generic, non-people related bias that I have is when it comes to buying products at the grocery store. I have found that I tend to buy a lot of products that are marketed to me with like browns and greens and earth tones because I have an implicit bias that I wasn't aware of until recently, that those are going to be the more healthy option. But if you pick up 2 packs of oatmeal, speaking of oatmeal, as a big oatmeal lover on this call, Erica and I both are. But if you compare both of our oatmeals that have bright colors and then one with like brown and green tones, they probably have the same amount, if not more sugar, or unhealthy in different ways. So, I've tried to identify just that very basic bias so that I'm not getting taken advantage of by, marketing tactics. But it's very important to expand this out into groups of people because those implicit biases can come up in areas that we wouldn't normally be aware of them and stop people from receiving the best services. So an example of an implicit bias that someone might have against someone with a disability is that they might go to a bus or something and not sit very close to a person with a disability. And they might not be aware of that. And the more and more that you challenge those things, you can say, well, why am I moving all the way to this other side of the bus? Why can't I sit next to this person? Another very common example is using baby talk when speaking to an adult with a developmental disability. Now, it's important to match your communication to the person's communication style. So that might mean simplifying your language, but that's different than talking to someone using baby talk. I would suggest, in fact, just saving baby talk for actual babies or puppies seem to like it a lot. So that's just a way in which, that can be perceived as pretty disrespectful and an example of an implicit bias against someone with a developmental disability. Next slide, please. And then an explicit bias is the opposite of that. So attitudes or beliefs that we have about a person or a group of people on a conscious level. So these are the biases that are sort of the traditional idea of bias, and they're the ones that we are aware of, whether they are positive or negative biases. And oftentimes when someone holds an explicit bias that they know of, they think that they have a good reason for that bias. And it's often based on a misunderstanding or a perceived threat or fear. So my just generic basic example of this is my fear of spiders, which is one of those biases that I do have to challenge, though I think that I have a good reason for the fear of spiders, because they could bite me, or I could, have one attack me or be aggressive. But if you look at the statistics, spider bites are super rare. A lot of spiders that you see in your home are not actually venomous or can't really do anything to you. And so if I challenge that bias, then I end up saving more spiders than I get rid of. And that's, a good thing in the end, I think, though some people in our office disagree with me. And so it's really important when it comes to those biases to learn the facts before you decide to act on an explicit bias. When it comes to people with disabilities, it's often a fear of the unknown. And I just want to say, knowledge and interacting with people with disabilities more and more makes that less scary, and that fear of the unknown go away. And then you can show up being your best self for a person with a disability. So an example here that we have of an explicit bias against someone with a disability: an employer could openly state during an interview that they aren't going to hire someone with a disability because they don't believe that they are capable of performing the necessary job tasks. One way in which you can challenge that bias is simply through the ADA. Are they able to complete those job tasks with reasonable accommodations? Probably. And so you have to challenge that, even though you think that that this person can't perform the job. Challenge that, talk with them, figure out what they need to complete the job. And, it's important to note that that's an example of an illegal bias. It's illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities. So I don't think I see anything in the chat unless my chat is frozen. So if that's the case, I'll go ahead and move on. Let's go to the next slide. So again, practice your awareness of your implicit biases, challenge your explicit biases, because it'll really impact your work with people with disabilities. Bias creates barriers and stops the best services for people with disabilities, especially when they need it most, especially with work with survivors, that, they really need to not have barriers to those supports and services when they need it. Next slide, please. So continue to think through your biases, as well as the biases that could come up in your work. So try to think beyond yourself and think about what are the common biases that can come up in our society against people with disabilities, because it might help you figure out what is going on in a situation if you try to think through what those common bias challenges that people with disabilities face. We've got a link up here that I'm going to post in the chat when I turn it over to Erica in just a second. This is just a really cool little quiz that is online to help you identify some of the biases that you might not be aware of. So feel free to take that if you want some help identifying those biases. But for now, I'm going to turn it back to Erica to talk about victimization.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Krystal. And I'm really grateful that we're able to have this conversation with all of you who are tuning in, because I think it's so important to understand how the way that our brain works can really impact our work with supporting survivors and getting everything that they need to go on the path of becoming a true survivor and no longer being a victim of a crime. So that kind of leads us into this next conversation of victimization of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The incidence and prevalence of victimization against people with disabilities is pretty staggering. And what I want you to know is that based upon these statistics, at some point you are going to work with someone who has been a victim of a crime, who has a developmental disability at some point. People with disabilities are statistically more likely to be a victim of a crime. And I'm going to get into a couple of reasons as to a couple of examples as to why that is on the next slide. But what I want you to know specific when we're talking about sexual assault, as many as 83% of women with developmental disabilities have been sexually abused, and 49% of those will experience 10 or more abusive incidents. So that means that repeated assaults will happen, which is incredibly unfortunate. And, if it just further amplifies to me and the work that our organization does on how important your work is in our communities in supporting victims in our communities, because it happens and it's gross and it's traumatic, but the work that you do is so incredibly important. And I just want you to know that we appreciate the work that you do. Another issue that we run into is that a lot of folks with disabilities, the crimes go underreported, unfortunately. And that is for an array of reasons. Sometimes people don't think that they are credible reporters, or maybe they don't quite understand what may have happened because they have a developmental disability. And what I do ask is, please do not make this assumption. I think people's lived experience who have developmental disabilities and them sharing their story is so important. And we all know that when we're supporting survivors, that we are to believe them. And the same goes for people who have developmental disabilities. I want to go over a couple of examples of why folks with developmental disabilities are at higher risk of being victimized, because this is really important to have a good understanding. As I kind of dive into this, what I want you to know is oftentimes MAME, so mistreatment, abuse, neglect, exploitation. Oftentimes what we have found is that it's perpetrated by someone the person with a disability already knows or is responsible for their care. So a lot of times folks with developmental disabilities, again, everyone is totally different. It's not one size fits all, but there could be a person with a developmental disability who is reliant on others for help and care. So that may be they are reliant on a caregiver to get them up every day, to undress them, to bathe them, to then redress them, cook their meals, or, as an example of kind of like a daily routine. And what happens is in these types of situations, the person with the disability is almost desensitized because they are touched every day, right? They're touched every day in which they are getting ready. And there may be this unfamiliarity in which they may not understand that the touching that has happened is actually inappropriate, or the caregiver who's doing the touching may just think that it's okay and the person's going to have no idea what's right and wrong. They do experience this heightened vulnerability from people in our community. They can be targeted. They have the desire to be included and make friends. There was this gentleman I worked with many moons ago who was incredibly independent. And, initially meeting him, you would have no clue that he has a developmental disability. It clearly wasn't obvious. So remember what I was saying earlier about how not all disabilities are visible. He was a perfect example. And he wanted friends so badly, but he didn't want friends who also had developmental disabilities. He wanted people that, did not require, supports that he did. And he said he wanted quote unquote normal friends. And there was this person, I think it was at a Walmart, who was kind of scoping him out because this gentleman was really routine oriented. And I think it was like something like every Wednesday morning, he would go to a Walmart and go do his routine. And someone was kind of scoping him out over the period of many, many weeks, realizing that this was his routine, and ultimately approached the guy and was trying to quote unquote friend him. And ultimately said, hey, if you go into this Walmart and you go get me 10 smartphones, I'll be your friend. And he was so excited, and he went in and he got all these smartphones because he was able to manage his own money. But he came back and he gave the smartphones, and the guy jetted and he just left. And the guy with the developmental disability was slammed with a really high bill, because we all know that smartphones are not cheap. So he was totally exploited for his kindness. And so that is something that happens, is that people just know that they are vulnerable. They may experience challenges with social interactions. For example, Krystal mentioned earlier that people with autism spectrum disorder, for example, it is a communication disorder, and to accompany that, it can come up with some social interaction challenges on understanding what's, a good and or maybe not great social interaction. Some with a developmental disability may be a very literal or concrete thinker, so I encourage you not to use sarcasm within your work with them. They may present as typical, like I said, like you may not even realize that the person has a developmental disability because it's not obvious. And another thing is that they may need more time and understanding commands or what's being asked of them, because sometimes people, I think there's kind of this loss of patience when we're trying to find out what maybe have happened to someone who has a developmental disability, because they do need more time to answer questions or to understand what you're telling them. And so what I want to show you next is a video of a woman who we have worked with as she shares her personal perspective of having a developmental disability and being a victim of a sexual assault. So I do know here in Zoom land, sometimes the audio may not match up with the video that you're seeing. So I apologize in advance if you experience that, but I would like for everyone to meet Linda.
I don't know
Erica,
about
I'm having
else,
some.
but we can't hear.
I'm sorry?
I can't hear the video.
I think you'll just have
Oh,
to share your sound as well. It might have gone away when you switched the screen sharing.
oh, I apologize, everyone. I'm so sorry. Let's see. Let me try this. Does this work?
No, still not hearing it.
Well, rats, it worked before we started the webinar. I apologize, everyone. I didn't change anything with my setup. Try this one.
No, still not coming through. I think there must just be a glitch in Zoom land.
Well, that is okay. I will move on and I will explain to you guys what Linda said. I apologize for any technical errors, but Linda is a woman with a developmental disability. And in her story in that video, what she shares is that she was a victim of a sexual assault, and she lived in basically what we like to refer to as an institution back in the day. That's kind of generally where folks with disabilities generally lived, but things have certainly moved on within our communities and worlds, and that's not really a place that people with disabilities live anymore. But basically a staff member raped her, and she kept saying no, and she kept saying no, and it happened. And she went on to share in that video the next time it happened. So she shared another time that she was sexually assaulted. And during that interview, she said, and then the next time it happened. So what I want you to know is that her story is a perfect example of how people with developmental disabilities will experience sexual assault repeatedly. And it's really important that we believe them and we make sure that this is reported. So that brings me to the next subject of mandatory reporters. They are required by law to report any mistreatment, abuse, neglect, exploitation within 24 hours. And who is a mandatory reporter? Well, there's a very long, exhaustive list, but commonly known maybe like medical providers or schools, or maybe it's a person who provides developmental disability services to someone who has a developmental disability. So what I want you to know is that it's really important that this happens, but if for some reason you suspect that there is something happening, that's okay to report. That's what we call good faith reporting, because you just want to make sure things are okay. If for some reason you were to file a fake report just out of hate for someone, or haste, if you will, that is not okay. And that would be accompanied by some pretty heavy court appearances and fines. So what you want to know about when it comes with mandatory reporters is that we need to report. If anything happens to people with IDD, people with who are mandatory reporters, they are not investigators, but they may have the information that you need. So again, they're required by law to report. And so this is something really important to keep in mind when you're working with someone with developmental disabilities, because there may be other people in their lives who could be incredibly helpful. And then of course, we want to rely on adult protective services for any help within that type of reporting. What I also want to kind of touch base on is some investigation best practices. I know that we have folks who are victim advocates here on this call. We also have some folks with law enforcement from what I remember. And so I just kind of want to give you a couple extra tips of folks and services that we've used within our work to make sure that folks with developmental disabilities are getting everything that they need for the best access on their path to becoming a survivor. So I want to touch base on a forensic interview. So you may or may not know what that is, but for a person with a developmental disability specifically, it's a specialized interview trained by a professional in the context of criminal investigation or legal proceedings. And it basically aims to gather information from individuals with DDs who may be a victim of a crime. And so these interviews are conducted in a sensitive and accommodating manner. Remember, I was talking about earlier about accommodations, and it really considers the person's maybe cognitive abilities and their communication needs. So the goal is really to create a safe environment for them to share their experiences and provide relevant information. And it really gives people with developmental disabilities a voice and to help make sure their rights are protected. So here within Colorado, things can look very different state to state, but generally what we use here in Colorado are children's advocacy centers to conduct those types of forensic interviews. There's also crisis intervention teams, depending on where you are in the world. This may be called something different, but these are basically officers on a team trained in de-escalating situations involving a person experiencing some type of crisis. So a lot of times, like, we will make sure like a CIT officer is present in the event that maybe someone with a developmental disability has experienced a sexual assault, for example, because they can be a really incredible resource and have kind of increased training for kind of dealing with kind of some challenging situations for special populations. When it comes to your work, just some gentle reminders, best practices: slow things down and listen carefully if you're working with someone who's been a victim of a crime who has a developmental disability. Avoid frustration. I understand that it can be a little tricky. Maybe you've asked the same question 5 different times, 5 different ways, and you're still not getting an answer. That's okay. Just take your time. Give yourself some grace, okay? Avoid sarcasm. I had mentioned that before. Remove distractions. If you're in a really kind of wild office area, go to a safe space that's calm and inviting and just can kind of help the person focus a little bit better. Be very calm, literal, and concrete. And I asked for you to look for something called echolalia. You may or may not have heard of it, and it could be many different ways. You may, for example, be with someone and I'll use Krystal as an example. And I say, Krystal, did the sexual assault happen at the library? And Krystal, the person with the developmental disability, may repeat, sexual assault happened at the library, right? So you don't want to ask leading questions because they may repeat what was said. Or another example of echolalia may be like, you go up to a person with a developmental disability and you say, what's up? And they quite literally look up and they go, what's up? What's up? What's up? What's up? So that could be another example of echolalia. So just some things to keep in mind. And then when it comes to specific to Colorado, we are a Colorado specific organization. I do want you to know about Colorado's hearsay exception for people with developmental disabilities. So you may or may not have heard of hearsay, but it's basically an out-of-court statement. And oftentimes the hearsay rule generally prohibits the use of out-of-court statements, but there is an exception to this rule for people with developmental disabilities. So if a person with a developmental disability does make an out-of-court statement that is relevant to certain crimes, that statement may be admissible as evidence, even though it's considered hearsay. And this exception basically recognizes that people with developmental disabilities may face unique challenges in communicating and participating in some legal proceedings. Additionally, what I want you to know is there are increased penalties for certain crimes committed against at-risk persons. An at-risk person, I think oftentimes people think of like, oh, our elders and people over 70. Well, an at-risk adult here in Colorado, that is a person with a developmental disability. So I just want you to keep those types of things in mind as we're kind of moving along this training. So what I want you to know about specific to folks with developmental disabilities, I'm going to be giving you an overview of what services and supports are available here in Colorado. However, a lot of what I'm saying is going to be very applicable to external of Colorado. So I just want you to understand about supports and services that are available that help support people with developmental disabilities. So I want to talk about Medicaid. That provides health coverage to millions of Americans, including people with developmental disabilities. And it can pay for things like nursing homes, doctor's visits, hospitals, things like that. Here in Colorado, it's called Health First Colorado, and it basically provides health insurance to people who need it. In another state, it may just simply be called Medicaid. So why are we talking about Medicaid? The reason we're talking about Medicaid is that Medicaid is not just for medical care. And again, this goes beyond Colorado. So if you're tuning in from beyond Colorado, this is applicable to your work. So most adults with developmental disabilities are eligible for something called long-term services, support services, or LTSS. And that's aimed at individuals with chronic illnesses, disability, or maybe some limitations. It helps with daily activities and tasks. And it can be provided in things like nursing homes, assisted living facilities, or other community settings. But what I want you to know is that there's also home and community-based services waivers, or HCBS. Again, these are in all the states. So people with LTSS may also have an HCBS Medicaid waiver. So it's like a subset of LTSS. And these are programs and services that are delivered in community settings rather than institutionalized settings, because we don't do institutions anymore. Okay, we've moved away from those. It basically can support people with living independently within our communities. So when we're talking about home and community-based services, they are waivers through Medicaid, and they're managed at the state level. Here specifically in Colorado, there are 10 waivers that support people with disabilities in Colorado. And people with IDD live in the community and will receive something they often refer to as quote unquote services when they're enrolled in a waiver. Another thing to keep in mind is that you may be working with an adult who has a developmental disability who may also have children. Yes, people with developmental disabilities they have sex, they get married, right? They're just like you or I. They may also have kiddos, though, who may have some higher needs that may also be enrolled on an HCBS waiver if they too have a disability. So these handouts will be distributed to you in the follow-up email, but specific to Colorado, there are 6 different HCBS waivers. I'm not going to go through all of them, but what I want you to know is that what's listed here in the yellow on your screen, or maybe it looks orange, those are the specific waivers that are available for people with developmental disabilities. So they are enrolled on them to live within their communities. There's also other waivers that support other unique disabilities, such as like the brain injury waiver, the mental health waiver, and then there's the integrated health waiver, which generally supports people who have spinal cord injuries. So if someone were enrolled on this, they would be able to get supplemental services to help them with their independence and care in the community. There's also 4 HCBS waivers here in the state of Colorado specific to kiddos. So for example, that may be like they have the Children's Life Limiting Illness waiver. That's for kiddos who unfortunately are really sick and they need a lot of care to help them with kind of their life limiting illness and end of life care. There's also a waiver that we often call like the CHIRP waiver, for example. That is a program in which kiddos with developmental disabilities are enrolled in this waiver. And it's similar to like foster care, but they're kiddos with developmental disabilities who go live somewhere where they can be cared for. Again, there are HCBS waivers all over the United States. All of the waivers are specific and unique to the state that you are in, but the majority of them can offer different types of services. So it can depend on the waiver. But what I want you to know is that this is really important to know when you're supporting a survivor, because you may be working with someone who they have a waiver and we need to get more services and supports in place to help them. Or maybe they're not even on a waiver. That happens a lot. People fall through the cracks, and we want to make sure they're getting the supports and services that they need through the system that is intended to help them. So there's things like personal care services. That's maybe helping with like bathing, dressing, eating, getting ready for the day, setting water temperature, things like that. There's homemaker services. Maybe that's things like grocery shopping, cleaning one's home. There's day program services. I have a brother who has a developmental disability. He goes to a day program 5 days a week so that his primary caretaker can go be a contributing citizen and work. So he has a safe place to go that provides him supervision because he can't be alone on his own. There's respite services. That's basically a service in which, say, like a mother who cares for her adult daughter needs a break. Respite can pay for someone to go take care of that daughter as a respite and a break for the mother. Transportation services. Here in Colorado, we have the Regional Transportation District, or RTD. It can pay for transportation to and from locations, or we also have Accessoride here in the metro area, which are kind of the smaller vehicles and vans that can help transport folks often who have like mobility disabilities. There's home and vehicle modifications. Home modification can look so different person to person, but say, for example, we're talking about a bathroom. And maybe it's someone who is a fall risk. And you think of that the lip on the bathtub that you have to step over in order to get into the tub. A home modification can make it so that we modify that tub and it's more of like a roll-in shower. So there's nothing to step over so that they don't fall. There's also behavioral services. That could be things like therapy, personal emergency response. We all know those commercials where they press the button and it's the help, I've fallen and I can't get up. It can pay for things like that. Vocational services, so that a person with a developmental disability can live and work in our communities with appropriate support so that they too can be a contributing citizen and be employed. It can pay for things like dental and vision, as well as residential, which I want to talk a little bit about as well. What we run into is people, I think, still don't always understand where people with IDD live. They live in all the same places you and I live. They may live with family, they may live with friends, they may have a roommate, they may live totally independent. They could live here in Colorado in something called a host home, which is where essentially the easiest way I can describe it is like adult foster care, right? An adult with an IDD goes and lives in a host home with a caregiver. They have their own room, they're part of the family, but that person's responsible for caring for them. They could live in an apartment with maybe some support staff coming in and out a few times a week to help them maybe just do a couple things. Or they could live in maybe a group home with rotating 24-hour staff who work shifts. So it can look very different person to person. We've said it again and again, people with IDD are not one size fits all, and everyone's needs can be very different and unique. Specific to Colorado, what we have are case management agencies, and they oversee the HCBS waivers. So that's something that's important to know, because these are the folks that you can contact if you ever need to figure out who is maybe receiving case management and other services for the person that you are supporting. And so as I'm talking, I'm kind of outdating myself right now because things are going to be shifting in the next year, which I'm going to be getting into a little bit. But what I want you to know right now currently is there's things called single entry points, and there's places called community-centered boards. The community-centered boards here in Colorado, specific to people with developmental disabilities, those are generally going to be the case management agency you would be in contact with when we're specifically talking about people with developmental disabilities. So what I have here are some maps. Those will also be provided to you all in the follow-up email. But there are single entry points, right? And there are CCBs. And I'm flipping back and forth here between these maps because you will see that the geographic boundaries between SEPs and CCBs are totally different, which, gosh, you know what, I know is very confusing. So for example, in the top left corner in Moffat County, that is in Region 17, and you'll look on the little guide to the right, Region 17 for Moffat County would be Northwest OLTC. But then I go over to the Community Center Board map, and they're now Region 10 for Moffat County. and the contact there is Horizons Special Services. So what I want you to know with these maps specific to where you are in Colorado, currently how things are is if you're supporting someone who has been a victim of a crime, I would encourage you to maybe reach out to both of those locations to see if the person maybe receives any support or services to make sure you're getting in touch with the right people. So like I said, I'm currently outdating myself because the future of case management is shifting as of July of next year. So there ultimately will be just single agencies called case management agencies. And so what it's going to do is consolidate those two maps that I just showed you of 44 single entry points and community center boards down to 20 different case management agencies, all serving certain geographic locations. So those case management agencies will continue to oversee and provide case management services to children and adults with developmental disabilities and other disabilities who are enrolled on HCBS waivers. So things are currently in the works right now with these changes. So you may see some changes within your particular geographic region, but everything is supposed to be in effect as of July 2024. And again, why would you be in touch with the case management agency? They're the contact to figure out what the services, supports, and contacts are for the victim that you're supporting. So you may call and say, I need to know if Krystal has someone called like a case manager or a resource coordinator because they've been a victim of a crime. And you may run into HIPAA challenges, which is a privacy law. But if it's a health and safety concern for the person with a developmental disability, you shouldn't and hopefully run into many issues. When I'm talking about services and supports, there are things here called program approved service agencies or PASAs. There's hundreds of them throughout Colorado. So someone enrolled on a home and community-based services waiver will generally have a case manager, what I just talked about. They'll usually have a PASA agency that is overseen by the case management agency, as well as like a provider or multiple providers that are employed by that one PASA or multiple PASAs. Those are the people that provide the direct services to the person. So maybe the provider is the person who takes that person grocery shopping every Wednesday, or the PASA is the day program that the person goes to 5 days a week. So just so you know, there's usually a team of people, a circle of supports in someone's life. They may also have someone like a civil relationship, like a guardian or a representative payee, family and friends, as well as an advocate at an ARC chapter. I do want to briefly touch base here in Colorado that there are something called regional centers. And I know I've said it again and again that we don't really have institutions here anymore, and that is true, but there are certain circumstances for people who cannot safely live in the community with 24-hour support. And these places, the regional centers, basically offer short-term stabilization, treatment, psychiatric and residential supports. But the goal is if someone were to go there, that they get back out in the community on their HCBS waiver within 120 days. So who might be there? I worked with someone in another position where he was really dangerous to the community. He had arson attempts, houses on fire, boats on fire, the gamut. He was very unstable. So we went to a regional center to get stabilized so that he could then be released and go live in the community. In the work that you do, supporting survivors of sexual assault, you may interact with someone who has really dangerous sexual behavior. That may be another person, as an example, who would go to a regional center. There's 3 state-owned regional centers here in the state of Colorado: Wheat Ridge, Pueblo, and Grand Junction, but there's only 350 beds available total. So it's very short-term stabilization, definitely not a long-term plan. Again, I want to remind you, Krystal said in the beginning, there's multiple chapters of the ARC here throughout Colorado. If you are outside of Colorado, a quick Google search can point you in the right direction, but you will also leave here with a map and some follow-up materials from CCASA of where all of the ARC chapters are that serve certain geographic areas. So you'll see there's many different of us throughout the entire state. And then as I'm kind of wrapping this up, what if you are with someone who has an IDD who needs support outside of that typical Monday through Friday, 8 to 5? The ARC chapters, we don't provide emergency services. The community-centered boards and single entry points do have after-hours call lines. If the victim has a program-approved service agency, so remember those people that provide the direct services to the person, they may be able to help. And if the person has, experienced any type of mistreatment, abuse, neglect, things like that, of course, call protective services first. then go to those supports on the team. So I want you to know, though, no matter where you are, there is often a team of people that supports the person with an IDD as their circle of supports. So I'm going to hand it on over to Krystal to kind of talk about some other resources applicable to your work.
Awesome. Yeah. So I'd love to dive into some of the training resources that we have from our chapter. As I mentioned before, we have a social enterprise called THINK+change, where we create resources to change knowledge, attitude, and behavior to improve the quality of life for people with developmental disabilities. And within that program, we have a plethora of materials, including a lot around victimization of people with IDD. So let's skip this next slide because I believe it's a video. So all of the training materials that we create are completely free of charge and available on our website in a variety of formats. We're able to keep all of these free through sponsorship and donors and all of that. And we've been creating materials since 2018. So there are over 60, coming close to 70 products available, covering a wide range of topics that affect the lives of people with IDD. Next slide, please. And our training materials fall into 3 categories. We have talks, trainings, and tools. So our talks are a storytelling series, and you can kind of think of these as mini documentaries that feature the perspectives of folks who are affected or involved in the topic that we are covering. So, for example, that video that we weren't able to show you, that's from a talk series called Victimization and People with IDD. If you head to our website, you'll be able to watch that interview with Linda. And we also have many others continuing to come out. We just produced one that is on people in our community who have immigrated to the United States and have a developmental disability and the challenges that they face in our immigration system. Then the next section of products that we have trainings where we dive deeper into a topic. So the talks are really to expose you to the issue, and then the trainings are to start to offer solutions for that issue. And we have 3 different versions of our trainings because we want to adapt our trainings into different learning styles so that everybody can access them. We have our THINK+change Academy, which these are courses that are usually about 1 to 2 hours long. And you can enroll in those and receive a certificate of completion at the end. And then we have smaller, less than 5-minute training videos called micro learning, which offers you learning in small digestible chunks. And then we have podcasts and vodcasts where we go out and we interview experts in the community on a certain topic. And then we produce a video version and an audio only version. So you can sit down and you can watch it on your laptop, or you can just pop it in your car on your way to work to listen to them. Our most recent vodcast, just as an example, we did one on trauma and developmental disability, and we're always producing more and more to try to amplify the voices of experts in our community who do have some solutions and some ideas on how to address an issue or a challenge. And then finally, we have our tools, and these are the reinforcement aspect of our products. So reinforcing all the learning that we produce through our trainings, and you can take a lot of those with you. We have some digital products that come in PDF handouts, guides, and a lot more. And then we have some physical, tangible tools, which I'm going to get into the ones that we're going to provide CICASA to hand out to those who are interested. But before that, let's go to the next slide. So like I said, we dive into a lot of different topics and continue to produce materials based on the issues that we see in our community. And because our advocates work directly with individuals in our community, that informs the trainings that we produce. So our trainings inform our advocacy, and our advocacy informs our trainings to try to create very relevant contemporary products. And just a few examples of some of the topics that we cover. We cover victimization, accessibility, learning how to effectively communicate with people with IDD. We talk about intersectionality between disability and other identities, such as race. And then we also have a lot that dives into disability systems specific topics, like stuff about navigating special education, and adult supports and services, and so much more. Like I said, it's a very large, confusing system. So we'd like to try to detangle that through some of our resources. And then finally, we really recognize that victim service providers play a huge role in ensuring that people with disabilities have access to the justice and healing that they deserve if they become a victim. So with that, we also try to offer as many possible resources so that you can do so. Next slide, please. So with these materials, we want you to not just have more education around folks with disabilities and the disability system. We also want our products to spur crucial conversations among you. And we want you to have these thoughtful conversations and education before you are in a crisis or addressing a crisis that addresses one of these specific topics. And you can hear firsthand accounts of people with disabilities in our community and what challenges they do face in their day-to-day. And like I said, all of these are available on demand so that you can fit them into your schedule. And we have a variety of ways in which you can access everything to, again, try to make things as accessible for everyone. Our podcasts can be downloaded through various podcatchers such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. You can also follow us on YouTube or Vimeo or Spreaker, which is another podcast platform. Or if you want to follow us on all the social medias, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm sure there will be some new social medias that are coming up. We break some of our products down into little snippets so you can see if you are interested in those products. So follow us there, or you can just head to our website, THINK+change.training, and check out all the products there. And we also, like I said, have some tangible tools that we felt was relevant to your work as a member of CCASA. And again, you can email Kathy to receive those products. So I'm going to just quickly describe what those are. Let's go to the next slide. So we have our communication quick tips, which is a handy pocket guide that you can take with you wherever you go in your work. And it breaks down like the best practices when it comes to communicating with people with IDD to get the most effective communication and be respectful as well as there's some helpful definitions in there and a list of local resources for those in Colorado. Next slide, please. And then this is our Every Victim Matters poster that you can hang up. And this poster is really a helpful guide when it comes to best practices, when it comes to supporting people with specific disabilities and accommodations, such as those who use a wheelchair, are blind or visually impaired, deaf or hard of hearing, have a developmental disability, or use a service animal. And this poster also goes over the importance of providing those supports to ensure true equal opportunity in your work with survivors. And it's a great thing to display also to just show that this is, top of mind in your work. Let's go to the next slide. So this isn't a physical thing that we'll be sending out, but this is something that will be in the email afterwards. It's a digital catalog where we've broken down our products into different topics and professions to try to help you access everything a little easier. And so this one is our Crime Victims Professionals catalog. I highly recommend checking out this catalog because it has every single product that we felt was relevant to your work. So I'll leave this up just for a moment in case you want to scan the QR code. But again, this will also be in the email that gets sent out later on. Awesome. So with that, we also just want to take a moment to thank you all for the work that you do to help survivors. And we appreciate the work that you do so much. Next slide. And thank you for sticking with us through this kind of long training. We are really happy to be able to partner with CCASA. It's really important for us to have the time to get to share this information, as our work can be very intertwined with the different professions that you all come from. We're going to dive into questions in just a few minutes, but if you guys think of any questions or you want to ask us any to expand on anything that we talked about in this training, Erica and my contact information is at the top. And this will also be in that email. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can also sign up for our newsletter at this QR code and link in the middle here. If you want to receive the products that we're putting out in the different trainings. And again, you can follow us on social media. We continuously put out information about all that we have available. We have THINK+change pages, as well as the Arc of Aurora, if you want to hear more about our community-based work and advocacy. So with that, I'm going to turn it actually back to Sierra to let us know if we had any questions come up in the chat. And if you have any questions now, please put them in the chat as well.